Fayetteville, West Virginia. 1945. A house catches fire on Christmas Eve. 5 children are believed to be trapped inside. The flames burn through the night. By morning, the house is gone. If you enjoy this kind of story, please subscribe, like, and share the video. It really helps the channel grow. Let's begin. On December 24th, 1945, the Sodder family gathered in their home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jenny Sodder had built a life there. Their house stood on a hillside overlooking the town, large enough to hold their 9 children. Christmas Eve was not unusual in its beginning. The older children were still awake past their usual bedtime, excited by the holiday. Some of the younger ones had already gone upstairs. It was a quiet night. Cold, but calm. Sometime around 1 a.m., Jenny was awakened by a sound. She later described it as something hitting the roof. A thud, heavy enough to notice, but not followed by anything else. The house returned to silence. She went back to sleep. Approximately 30 minutes later, she woke again. This time, it was the smell of smoke. When she rose from bed and stepped into the hallway, she saw flames spreading along the ceiling. The fire appeared to have started near the office area of the home, where the telephone was located. Within moments, smoke began filling the rooms. George and Jenny moved quickly. They shouted for the children. 4 of them managed to escape with their parents. The fire was spreading rapidly, consuming the structure faster than expected. Outside, in the snow, the realization set in. 5 children were still inside. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty had been sleeping upstairs. The staircase was already engulfed in flames. There was no safe way to reach the second floor from inside. The heat and smoke made re-entry impossible. George attempted to act. He ran to the house phone to call for help, but it was dead. Later, investigation would determine that the telephone line had been cut from outside the home. He then tried to use his trucks, parked nearby, to reach the upper windows. His plan was to climb onto the vehicles and attempt a rescue. Both trucks failed to start. According to George, they had functioned normally the day before. He searched for a ladder he kept against the house. It was gone. Within approximately 45 minutes, the house was fully consumed. The family watched as the structure collapsed inward. The flames burned through the roof and upper floor. There was nothing more they could do. By the time firefighters arrived, the home had been reduced to rubble and ash. The official assumption was immediate and straightforward. The 5 children had perished in the fire. But the events of that night would soon raise questions that would linger for decades. Because when the fire died down and the ruins were examined, something expected was missing. In the hours that followed the fire, the shock of what had happened overshadowed everything else. Neighbors gathered in the cold night air while smoke continued to rise from the ruins. Snow reflected the orange glow that had consumed the house only minutes earlier. At first, the event appeared to be a tragic accident, one more house fire in a rural town at the end of the war. But as daylight came and details were examined more closely, the sequence of failures from that night began to form a troubling pattern. When George had attempted to call for help during the fire, the telephone inside the house had been dead. At the time, it seemed like another cruel consequence of the blaze. However, further inspection revealed that the line had not simply burned through. The wire had been cut from outside the home. It had been physically severed. This discovery introduced a possibility that could not easily be dismissed. If the line had been cut before the fire spread, someone had interfered with the family's ability to call for help. The trucks presented another complication. George owned 2 coal-hauling vehicles, both of which had reportedly functioned without issue the day before. In the chaos of the fire, he ran to them with the intention of positioning them beneath the upstairs windows so he could attempt a rescue. Neither truck started. Whether due to mechanical failure or another cause has never been conclusively determined, but their simultaneous failure at that precise moment deepened his suspicion. The missing ladder was equally unsettling. George kept a ladder propped against the side of the house, specifically for situations that required access to the upper floor. When he searched for it during the fire, it was nowhere to be found. Days later, the ladder was reportedly discovered discarded in a nearby embankment. No one could explain how it had gotten there. Individually, each of these elements might have been explained away. Wires can be damaged, engines can fail, objects can be misplaced. But together, they created a sequence that felt deliberate. There were also reports of unusual incidents in the weeks leading up to the fire. Jenny had received a phone call from a woman asking for someone she did not recognize. According to her account, laughter could be heard in the background before the caller abruptly hung up. On another occasion, a man offering repair work had allegedly warned George that the house could one day go up in flames, making reference to the electrical system. At the time, the comment seemed strange but insignificant. Whether these events were connected to what happened on Christmas Eve has never been proven. The official conclusion pointed to faulty wiring as the likely cause of the fire. The case was closed relatively quickly, but for George and Jenny, the explanation did not resolve the questions. The phone line had been cut, the ladder had been moved, the trucks had failed, and 5 children were still unaccounted for. The assumption was that they had perished in the flames. What investigators found in the ashes the following day would challenge that assumption in a way no one expected. By the morning of December 25th, the Sodder home had been reduced to rubble. Smoke still rose from the debris as neighbors and local officials began examining what remained. The structure had burned quickly and intensely, collapsing inward as the upper floors gave way. In situations like this, the expectation was clear. If 5 children had been trapped inside, some physical trace of them would remain. Investigators sifted through the ashes. What they reported finding was minimal. Household items, fragments of roofing, sections of collapsed flooring. But no clearly identifiable human remains. There were no intact bones recovered from the site, no recognizable skull fragments, no visible teeth. Nothing that could be conclusively identified as belonging to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, or Betty. The official explanation did not change. Authorities concluded that the children had died in the fire and that the intensity of the blaze had destroyed the remains beyond recognition. A death certificate was eventually issued listing the cause as fire. For George and Jenny, this explanation felt incomplete. Over time, they began consulting individuals outside the original investigation. Some specialists suggested that even in severe residential fires, bone fragments typically remain. Complete cremation requires sustained, controlled temperatures that are generally higher than those reached in ordinary house fires. According to these opinions, some physical evidence would normally be expected. However, the exact temperature of the Sodder fire was never formally documented in a way that would allow for a precise comparison. The house had burned for approximately 45 minutes before collapsing, and firefighters arrived hours later due to delays in notification. The conditions inside the structure during those minutes remain uncertain. The absence of remains became the foundation of the family's doubt. If the children had truly perished upstairs, where were the bones? Where were the fragments? Even partial remains could have provided certainty. Instead, there was only ash. This absence did not prove that the children had survived. Fires can produce unpredictable results, and incomplete recovery of remains is not impossible. But for George and Jenny, the lack of physical evidence, combined with the cut phone line, the missing ladder, and the disabled trucks, created a pattern that was difficult to ignore. They began to question not only how the fire started, but whether their children had ever been inside when it fully engulfed the home. The official case moved toward closure. For the Sodders, it was only the beginning. Because if the children had not died in the flames, then something else had happened that night. And someone may have known about it. In the weeks that followed the fire, George and Jenny Sodder began hearing things that unsettled them further. Some accounts came from neighbors, others from strangers. None were officially confirmed, but they added layers of doubt to an already fragile explanation. One witness claimed to have seen a man near the Sodder property on the day before the fire, allegedly inspecting the house. Another reported seeing a car parked along the road during the blaze. There were also later statements suggesting that children resembling the missing five had been seen traveling with unfamiliar adults in the hours after the fire. These reports were never verified, but they were not easily dismissed either. The most persistent question was whether the fire had been deliberately set. The cut telephone line indicated outside interference. The ladder's removal suggested preparation. The failure of the trucks, whether mechanical or coincidental, occurred at the exact moment rescue was attempted. Individually, each detail could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern that implied planning. There was also the matter of George Sodder's background. George had been outspoken about his political views, particularly regarding developments in Italy during the 1940s. According to family accounts, he had expressed criticism of the regime then in power. Some relatives later speculated that these opinions may have led to tension within segments of the local immigrant community. However, no documented evidence directly connects his views to the fire or to any organized retaliation. Theories involving organized crime or abduction circulated for years. None were proven. Law enforcement never produced a suspect tied conclusively to a kidnapping. What remained were fragments of possibility. If the children had been taken before the fire fully consumed the house, the blaze could have served as distraction or cover. That theory relied heavily on the absence of remains and the suspicious failures of that night. It also required coordination and motive, neither of which were ever established with certainty. Officials maintained that the simplest explanation was the most likely one. The children had died in the fire. George and Jenny refused to accept that conclusion. For them, the absence of evidence was not proof of death. It was proof of uncertainty. And uncertainty, once it takes hold, does not disappear easily. In the years that followed, the Sodders did not move on. While official records listed the 5 children as deceased, George and Jenny refused to accept the conclusion. For them, the absence of remains was not a minor detail. It was the central fact of the case. They began conducting their own investigation. George traveled repeatedly, following leads that surfaced through letters, phone calls, and word of mouth. Most of them led nowhere. Some turned out to be misunderstandings. Others were deliberate false reports. But each one was pursued. Eventually, the family erected a large billboard along a highway near Fayetteville. It displayed the photographs of the 5 missing children and offered a reward for information. The sign stood for decades. Drivers passing through the area could not miss it. The images aged in the sun and weather, but the message remained constant. The reward increased over time. The billboard became more than a plea for help. It became a declaration that the case was not closed, at least not to the parents. There were reported sightings over the years. One woman claimed to have seen children resembling the Sodders at a roadside stop shortly after the fire. A hotel clerk in another state later reported that a group of children accompanied by 2 women and 2 men had stayed overnight and appeared guarded. None of these accounts were substantiated with evidence strong enough to reopen the case officially. Then, in 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, the family received a photograph in the mail. It depicted a young man in his 20s. On the back, a handwritten message read, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Lil Boys, a 90132. Louis would have been in his early 20s at that time. The resemblance, according to the family, was striking. The photograph was never authenticated. The sender was never identified. George reportedly attempted to have the image analyzed and to track its origin, but no definitive results were made public. To some observers, it was another cruel hoax. To the Sodders, it was hope. George died in 1969. Jenny continued living in the home they rebuilt on the same property. She kept the billboard standing for as long as possible. The search never formally ended, even as official interest faded. The case remained suspended between 2 explanations: a fatal house fire or a disappearance masked by flames. Decades later, there is still no definitive answer, only ash, photographs, and a sign that once stood beside the road, asking a question no one could resolve. By the time official interest faded, the facts had settled into 2 opposing narratives. One was simple and procedural: a house fire, 5 children upstairs, a tragic loss in the middle of the night. The kind of story that, while devastating, requires no conspiracy to explain. The other narrative existed in the space left behind by uncertainty. It did not claim proof. It asked questions. The Sodder case endures because it lacks something essential: confirmation. There was no funeral for 5 children, no gravesite to visit, no physical closure that allowed grief to follow its expected path. Instead, there was a void, a place where evidence should have been. Over time, that void became the story. For some, the absence of remains is a tragic anomaly, not a mystery. Fires can behave unpredictably. Records from the 1940s were imperfect. Investigations were not as precise as modern standards demand. For others, the unanswered details are too numerous to dismiss. The night did not unfold cleanly. Too many elements failed at once. Too many questions remained open. The truth may be ordinary. It may also be extraordinary. But without definitive evidence, the case rests in suspension. A fire that destroyed a house, an absence that destroyed certainty, and 5 names that remain unconfirmed, not because they were forgotten, but because they were never conclusively found.